Hello everyone, and welcome to Anomaly Archive where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you're listening to my videos from since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's reach 10 subscribers until the end of this month. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. I had just moved into the old farmhouse at the edge of town, looking forward to the peace and isolation. It was a far cry from the hustle of city life, and I needed that space to think, time to breathe. The house itself had an eerie charm, weathered by years of neglect, but with a quiet beauty to it, surrounded by overgrown fields and thick trees. The neighborhood was small, consisting of only a handful of homes, spaced far apart. It felt like a community that valued its privacy, which suited me just fine. On the first morning after my arrival, I found a letter slid under my door. It was a typed sheet, carefully folded, and the envelope contained something I hadn't expected, a list of rules for all new residents. No one had personally introduced themselves, but this felt like their way of welcoming me. As I scanned the rules, most of them were standard. Keep noise levels down, respect the land, don't trespass on private property. But near the bottom, one item stood out, scrawled in bold, almost frantic writing. Rule number 13, never look outside at 3:07 a.m. At first, I thought it was a typo, or maybe some strange local superstition. But the rule went on, if you hear whistling at that time, don't look out the window. Don't open the door. Don't step outside. Don't speak to him. If you do, there will be consequences. I frowned. Was this some kind of joke? It certainly didn't seem like the usual kind of neighborly advice. I kept reading, but the list didn't elaborate. There were no specifics, no further explanation, just a warning. At the very bottom, someone had added in handwriting, just don't look. Trust us. I tried to shrug it off. Surely it was some elaborate prank or a weird tradition I hadn't yet understood. But it stuck with me. I had barely started unpacking when I heard it, the whistling. It started at exactly 3:07 a.m., sharp and clear, coming from somewhere outside. It wasn't loud, but it carried, cutting through the silence of the house like a blade. For a moment, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, or perhaps an animal in the distance. But no, it was too distinct, too rhythmic, too deliberate. It kept going, echoing through the house in a melody I couldn't quite place. It was eerie, unnerving, like something from a forgotten dream. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 3:07 a.m. The rule from the letter flashed in my mind. Don't look. I didn't. But the longer I listened, the harder it became to resist. It felt like the sound was pulling me in, urging me to look, to see what was out there. My eyes kept drifting toward the window, my feet slowly moving toward it. Despite my best efforts to stay in bed, I could almost feel something out there, just beyond the glass, waiting, watching. The thought of looking terrified me, but I couldn't stop myself from inching closer to the window. Then the whistling stopped. Silence. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. That stillness felt wrong, too wrong. I hesitated, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I heard it at all? Or had it been a dream? I crept back to the window, my hand shaking as I reached for the curtain. But then the second I touched it, I heard it again, closer this time, a low, almost mocking tune that felt like it was directly beneath my window. A shiver ran down my spine. But it wasn't fear. It was a sense of urgency, something far deeper. I tore my hand away from the curtain, falling back into my bed. But I could still hear the whistling, moving around the house, pacing, circling like it was waiting for something. I pulled the blankets over my head, praying it would go away, telling myself it was all in my mind. I tried to sleep, but the whistling grew louder, more distinct, more desperate. I could feel it pressing against the walls, filling every corner of the room. The moment the clock hit 3:08 a.m., the sound cut off, as if the universe itself had exhaled. It was over. I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, the sun felt too bright, almost glaring. I kept hearing that tune in my head, a ghost of something that shouldn't have been real. Later that day, I met a few of my neighbors while shopping in town. They seemed kind, friendly, but there was a stiffness to their smiles. When I mentioned the strange noise I'd heard the night before, they didn't seem surprised. In fact, they looked almost relieved that I was asking. "You heard it too?" One of them, an older man named Greg, said with a nervous chuckle. That's part of living here. We all hear it at some point. It's just how things are. Just don't look, all right?" I nodded, suddenly understanding. They all knew. They had all heard it, and they had all obeyed the rule, just like I had. But the question gnawed at me. What would have happened if I had looked? Days went by, but the whistling didn't return. I kept the windows shut tight, the curtains drawn, not daring to repeat my near mistake. Yet, something about that quiet stillness unsettled me more than the noise itself. The silence after 3:08 a.m. was worse. It felt like the calm before something terrible, like I was being watched by something I couldn't see. Then one evening, just as I was settling down for bed, I heard a knock at the door. It was 3:07 a.m. I didn't open it. I didn't even move. But the whistling started again, only this time, it was right on the other side of the door. And now I knew. He was watching me, and I couldn't help but feel that he was waiting for me to break the rule, to look. Days passed, and the whistling continued to haunt my thoughts, though it hadn't returned after that first night. I kept to the rules, spending my days in the house, too afraid to look outside, even during daylight. The sun didn't feel as warm here, and every shadow seemed to linger longer than it should. Then one afternoon, I saw someone standing in my yard. I stepped to the window and saw Greg, the older neighbor who'd been so kind and so cryptic about the strange happenings. He waved at me, a tight, nervous smile on his face, and I slowly opened the door. "Hey, Greg," I greeted, trying to seem casual. "What brings you over?" "Well, I just thought we should chat. Get to know each other better, since you're still pretty new around here," he said, taking a step back, almost as though he were trying to gauge my reaction. "And well, there's something I need to warn you about. You've been here a while, right?" "Yeah, a week or so. Everything's been fine." I paused, feeling a pit form in my stomach. "What's up?" Greg hesitated. "It's just, I've noticed something, and I need to know if you've heard the whistling yet." His voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. "I did. The other night," I admitted, "around 3:07 a.m., and it was unnerving." His eyes widened slightly, his expression going more serious. "Did you look?" I shook my head. "No." I followed the rules. Greg let out a breath, as though relieved by my answer. But there was something else behind his eyes, a glimmer of something darker. "You know," he continued slowly, "I have a friend who's a bit braver than you. He thought the whole thing was just some kind of superstition. He heard the whistling, just like you did, and he figured he'd prove it was all nonsense." He paused, studying my face carefully. He went outside, looked right at it. I swallowed hard. "What happened?" Greg's smile faltered, and he took a step back. "I don't know. He's gone," and we all agreed not to talk about it. "But I guess you should know." My heart raced, and I could barely breathe. "Gone? You mean He disappeared, yes," Greg interrupted, his voice soft but heavy with something I couldn't place. "It's what happens if you look. He didn't just vanish. No, something took him. Something from out there, from the dark." I stared at Greg, not knowing what to think. He seemed so matter-of-fact, yet there was an edge to his words, a tremor that spoke volumes. I didn't know what kind of warning he was giving, but it was clear that whatever happened to his friend wasn't something I wanted to experience. "Look," Greg said, finally stepping back. eyes fixed on mine with a sudden intensity. "You're not going to see him again. Not unless you do what he did." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "And what's that?" "Look at the whistler," Greg said, his tone lowering to a whisper, "and you'll understand. You'll see what happened. But if you do, you won't ever be the same." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away without another word. I stood there, frozen, my mind spinning, trying to piece together the implications of his cryptic message. I didn't know what Greg meant about understanding or seeing what happened, but something deep inside me told me it was dangerous to find out. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. The next night, as the clock approached 3:07 a.m., I found myself standing by the window again, watching the dark outside. The air felt thicker, charged, as if something was about to happen. My curiosity gnawed at me. What would I see if I looked? Would I be like Greg's friend? Would I finally understand? Then, just as the clock hit 3:07 a.m., I heard it, the whistling. I stood frozen, torn between the rule I had followed so far and the temptation to break it. I clenched my fists, looking out into the night, fighting against the urge to peel back the curtain, to glimpse whatever was out there. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement, something too quick to fully register. My hand flew back from the curtain, and my heart stopped. Someone was outside, not a figure I could recognize, just a silhouette in the shadows, moving in rhythm with the whistling. I looked away, instinctively, as the sound grew louder, closer, surrounding the house. But then, the whistling stopped, and before I could breathe again, a knock echoed through the door. 3:07 a.m. I didn't open it. I couldn't. But the knock persisted, growing more frantic, as if it were pounding directly against the walls of my mind. Suddenly, a chill ran through the house, colder than it had ever been before. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something dragging along the ground like a scraping noise just outside the door. I knew, in that instant, I wasn't alone. But it wasn't just anyone out there. It was something that had been waiting for me to make the wrong choice. Greg's friend had made the mistake. And now, the whistling had stopped. The house had gone dead silent. I felt the tension rise in the air, as though something was drawing closer, just out of reach. Then, a whisper, so faint that I could barely hear it, brushed against my ear. "Look." I fought the impulse. I wouldn't look, and yet, that one word echoed in my mind, louder than anything else, daring me to break the rule. Then the door rattled, the knocking stopped, and I knew something had changed. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel a lump forming in my throat as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind raced, replaying the words from the neighborhood rules, the warning I'd brushed off as superstition. And then, in the midst of the silence, I dialed Greg's number. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice shaky when he answered. "Hello." "Greg," I whispered, almost pleading. "It's happening. The knocking stopped, but I think it's still out there. I need to know if it's gone. Can you look from your window?" There was a long pause, and I could hear Greg's breath catch on the other end. "You know better than this," he muttered, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "You shouldn't, but all right. I'll take a look. Just stay inside." I didn't answer. I just held the phone to my ear, trembling as I listened to the soft rustle of Greg moving in his house. I knew he was standing at the window, just like I had, his hand hovering over the blinds, unsure whether to look. I waited, time dragging on, feeling every second like an eternity. Then a soft whistling sound, a breeze in the distance, at first so faint I almost thought it was my imagination. But it grew louder, sharper, as if someone was slowly walking closer. "Greg?" I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. "What do you see?" There was no response, just the growing whistling. My blood ran cold as the sound grew louder, closer. Then, suddenly, a screech split the silence. A horrible, high-pitched sound that cut through the air like nails on a chalkboard. My stomach churned as the whistling stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath, praying Greg had stayed safe. But then, through the phone, I heard a scream, a desperate, strangled cry from Greg's house. It was brief, gut-wrenching, and then nothing. I didn't hesitate. I ran through my house, heading for the bathroom. The toilet was the only place I could think of to hide, the only place I felt might offer some protection. My hands shook as I locked the bathroom door, crouching in the corner behind the tub, trying to make myself as small as possible. The whistling was louder now, unmistakable. It was right outside the bathroom door. My breath caught in my throat, and I could hear it, footsteps, heavy and slow, pacing right outside. The whistling sound was low and menacing, coming from just behind the door. It was so close I could almost feel the chill in the air. I pressed myself against the cold tiles, fighting to stay silent, praying it wouldn't find me. Then the door creaked. I held my breath, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin as the whistling paused for a moment. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. The door shook again. The whistling resumed, now right outside the crack between the door and the frame. A soft whispering noise followed, a low mutter I couldn't understand. My hands tightened around the edge of the bathtub, my legs trembling with every passing second. But then, the sound stopped. The whistling ceased, the footsteps faded away, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but the distant sound of the wind outside. I stayed crouched in the dark, waiting until I finally dared to move. Slowly, cautiously, I crept to the bathroom door, cracking it open just a sliver. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made everything feel wrong. The whistler was gone, for now. I stumbled outside, just as the first light of day broke over the horizon. The sunlight streamed through the windows, chasing away the shadows and bringing the reality of the situation into sharp focus. I could still hear the faint ringing of Greg's scream in my ears. But Greg was gone. There was no sign of him. The neighborhood was silent, and the air felt heavy, as if something terrible had just happened. But at least I had survived. I left the house, making my way to my family's home, needing the safety of familiar faces. I stayed with them, hoping that the nightmare was finally over. Weeks passed. I tried to move on, but the memory of the whistler haunted me. I didn't feel safe. I couldn't help but wonder that something was still out there, waiting. One night, I woke up to the soft sound of a whistle. It was faint at first, like a distant memory, but then it grew louder. The unmistakable tune I'd heard on that horrible night. It was 3:07 a.m. I froze, paralyzed with terror, as the whistling filled the room. I held my breath, praying that it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was back, and this time, it wasn't going to stop until it had taken me too. I stood at the edge of the woods, the trees leaning in like soldiers at attention. The trail was faint. It barely cut through the undergrowth, but I knew it was there. It had been waiting for me. The symbols on the old paper had led me here. A twisted, pale branch reached out to catch my sleeve, pulling me toward the dark earth. I hesitated. Something didn't feel right, but I moved forward. The ground softened beneath my boots. A rustle in the distance made my skin crawl. It was only the wind, but the unease still hung thick in the air. He sat beneath an old oak. I didn't see him at first. He blended with the shadows, his face hidden under a thick beard. When he spoke, It was barely more than a growl. "You don't belong here." His eyes met mine, intense, unnerving. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of his words. He stood slow, deliberate. His coat was ragged, covered in mud. He moved with the ease of someone who had spent too long in these woods. "They're watching," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You'll see them soon." I felt it before I saw it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was something wrong with the air. It wasn't just the woods anymore. It was something else, something old, something waiting. A snap of a twig. I spun around. The stranger was already moving. He didn't hesitate. He drew something from his coat, a long, jagged knife. He held it like it was an extension of his hand, sharp, deadly. "Run," he said, just as the rustle became a sudden burst of movement. They came from all sides. Two men, both dressed in black, faces obscured by masks. They moved too fast, too precisely. The first man lunged at me, knife drawn. I dodged, barely. I felt the cold blade graze my shoulder. The pain was sharp, sudden, but I kept moving. The second man was behind me before I could turn. He grabbed my wrist, yanking me back. I threw my elbow into his ribs, but it didn't stop him. He slammed me against a tree, and everything went dark for a moment. My head throbbed. Blood filled my mouth. I couldn't breathe. My vision swam, and the world spun. The second man had let go of me. I didn't know why. I didn't think. I pushed off the ground and ran, faster than I ever had in my life. I heard their boots hitting the dirt behind me. I could hear the strangers shouting, but it was too far off. The trees blurred together. The branches scraped at my face, drawing blood. My lungs burned, and my feet stumbled on uneven ground. I heard a shout. The first man was gaining on me. The sound of a gunshot stopped me cold. A sharp crack, followed by the sound of a body hitting the ground. I turned. A woman stood in the clearing. She had a rifle slung over her shoulder, her eyes as cold as the steel in her hands. The first man lay in a heap, blood pouring from his shoulder. He wouldn't be moving again. The woman didn't smile, didn't speak. She looked at the second man who stood there, frozen. "Get him," she said to him, calm, steady. The man moved toward her, but she shot him before he could take another step. His body dropped like a rag doll. The woman turned to me. "Come with me. Now." We moved quickly through the woods, the sound of our steps muffled by the thick underbrush. We reached a shack, small, decrepit. The woman opened the door with a shove and stepped inside. I followed. The shack was dark, save for the dim light coming from a single oil lamp. "They've been tracking you," the woman said, her eyes never leaving me. "You found something you shouldn't have. They won't stop coming." She didn't explain what she meant by they, and I didn't ask. My head was still spinning, still trying to process what had just happened. She set the rifle down and turned to face me. "You're in this now, whether you like it or not," she said. "They'll come for you again. They don't stop. This isn't about what you found. It's about what you represent." She leaned in, her breath cold against my ear. "It's not just you they want. It's anyone who dares uncover the truth." I wanted to ask her more, but the words stuck in my throat. Her voice had changed. It wasn't just cold now. It was desperate too. It hit me then, the weight of it all. The chase, the symbols, the stranger, the woman, it was all connected. I hadn't just stumbled into something. I had been pulled into it, dragged through the underbrush like a deer caught in a snare. It didn't matter whether I wanted to be part of this anymore. I was. The woman was right. They weren't going to stop. The man I'd seen in the clearing wasn't just an ordinary thug. He had been hunting me, and there was no way out. She moved toward the door. "Stay here. I'll be back soon. Don't make a sound. Don't go anywhere." Her voice was tight, strained, like she knew something I didn't. I nodded, though I didn't plan to stay. Not for long. I had to understand what was going on, what had brought me here, what had dragged me into this mess. I looked around the shack, trying to make sense of anything. a map tacked to the wall, a few old newspapers. Nothing that would explain the mess I was in. I had to get out. I had to find the answers myself. The woman didn't know everything. No one did. I grabbed my jacket, shoved the map into my pocket, and moved quietly toward the door. The woods outside were still. Too still. I stepped out, cautious, listening. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves. I felt the pressure of it, the weight of the trees bearing down on me. Something was wrong. Something was always wrong now. Before I could move further, I heard it, the faintest whisper of a voice. Low, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "You're being watched," the woman had said earlier. I turned. My hand dropped to the knife in my belt. I wasn't sure if it would be enough. The clearing behind me remained silent. Then, like a rush of cold water, the forest came alive with the sound of footsteps. They were close, too close. I ran deeper into the woods, the shadows stretching and warping around me. My legs burned. My breath came in ragged bursts. I had no plan anymore. I only knew I had to move. The sound of boots crashing behind me told me they were still coming. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I didn't stop. I'd seen what they did to the stranger. I couldn't let them catch me. The underbrush snagged my clothes, tearing at my jacket. I pushed through it, ignoring the pain, until I felt the cool bite of the air shift. It wasn't just the forest anymore. Something else was here. I stumbled over a tree root. My foot caught, and I fell forward, sprawling onto the wet ground. My hands sank into the earth. I didn't get up. The sound of movement was all around me now, closer, faster. They had surrounded me. I could hear them breathing, but it was quieter, almost too quiet. I kept my face against the dirt, trying to control the tremors in my limbs. A shadow fell across me. The man I'd seen earlier stood over me. His mask was torn, but his eyes were sharp, hungry. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He pulled the knife from his belt, a blade that glinted in the dim light. He knelt beside me, slow, deliberate. His breath smelled of something rancid. He grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully. The sharp edge of the blade pressed into my skin. He sliced across my forearm. The pain was like fire, but I didn't scream. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The blood poured out quickly, soaking into the earth beneath me. He stood then, stepping back, waiting. I didn't know how much time had passed. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. My arm felt numb. The bleeding had slowed, but the pain didn't stop. I heard the crunch of leaves underfoot again. This time, it wasn't the man in the mask. It was a stranger. His coat was torn, his face smeared with dirt, but he was alive. He'd come back for me. "Get up," he rasped. "You have to move now." He pulled me up by my good arm. I could barely stand. My legs wobbled. I didn't know how long I could keep going, but I had no choice. The stranger dragged me along the path, his grip firm on my arm. I didn't see the others. I didn't need to. I could feel them in the trees, stalking, watching. The woods were alive with their presence. It wasn't just the sound of their feet that echoed in my mind. It was the smell, the stale, pungent odor of sweat and blood. They were getting closer. The stranger's breathing was shallow. I could hear it. He was scared too, but he didn't stop. Neither did I. We reached the cabin just as the first rays of dawn cracked through the canopy. The stranger threw open the door, shoving me inside. I stumbled, hitting the floor hard. The cabin was a mess. Empty bottles, old newspapers, walls covered in strange markings. The door slammed shut behind me. The stranger was already looking for something. He threw open a cabinet, pulling out an old rifle, checking the chamber. "They'll be here soon," he said. "This is our last stand." I didn't have a weapon. I wasn't prepared, but I wasn't going to let them drag me back out there. I grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor and stood, my knees shaking. The stranger moved quickly, loading the rifle and positioning himself by the window. He fired once, twice, but they didn't stop. They kept coming. I heard the crack of wood splintering, the sound of fists hitting the door. I could feel the pressure building, the anticipation. The door flew open with a force I couldn't imagine. The first man, the one with the mask, was the first through. The stranger fired at him before he even crossed the threshold. The shot hit the man in the chest. He staggered back but didn't fall. He grinned. The stranger fired again. This time, the man went down. But there were more of them. Too many. They poured into the cabin like water through cracks. I swung the piece of what I had, catching one of them in the ribs. It didn't do much. The man barely flinched. His hand came down hard on my wrist, snapping it. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos. The stranger dropped the rifle. His face twisted with fear and something else, something darker. He looked at me, then at the door, then back at me again. "You don't understand," he muttered. His words were too soft for the noise around us. He backed away from me, eyes wild. "They sent me here to find you, to bring you back." I didn't have time to process it. One of the men lunged at the stranger, grabbing him by the throat. I turned and ran, clutching my broken wrist to my chest. I didn't look back. I heard them behind me, their footsteps thumping on the old wooden floorboards. They moved fast, but not fast enough. I reached the back door and kicked it open with my foot. The air was cold. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The world outside was just as dark as the cabin, but there was no time to think. I ran. The woods swallowed me whole again, but this time, I wasn't alone. They were close. I could hear their voices, their breath, growing louder. I pushed through the trees, the pain in my wrist shooting up my arm with every step. I had to get away. I had to keep moving. I heard a snap behind me. The man was catching up. I had no strength left to outrun him. I turned. He was only a few feet away now. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He raised his hand, and I saw the glint of the blade once again. He lunged at me, but something stopped him, something that made him hesitate. A gunshot rang through the air. The man dropped to the ground, blood pouring from his chest. The woman from the cabin was there. She was calm, too calm. She stepped over the body and approached me. She didn't speak. She just reached out and grabbed my uninjured arm, pulling me away from the body. "We're not done," she said quietly. "It's just beginning." I didn't know what time it was. The sun had long gone, replaced by an oppressive blackness that seemed to suffocate everything. The woman, Julia, kept pulling me along. Her grip was strong. I tried to keep pace, but the pain in my wrist, the fear, the exhaustion, everything slowed me. We moved through the woods, stepping over branches and rocks. Every sound echoed, magnified, as if the forest itself was closing in. The smell of blood hung thick in the air, but it wasn't mine. It was theirs, and I was still running. The noise followed us, relentless. I could hear them in the distance, the sound of boots hitting the dirt. They were coming for me. I didn't have to look behind to know they were closing in. Julia didn't stop. She moved like an animal, fluid, swift. But she wasn't leading me to safety. She was leading me into something worse. I could feel it, the way her breath quickened, the way she checked over her shoulder every few seconds. She was afraid too. Julia stopped abruptly. We were at the edge of a ravine, the drop so steep I couldn't see the bottom. The ground beneath my feet shifted. There was no way around it. She turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw it. The glint in her eyes, the smile that twisted her lips. "This is where it ends," she said. "You thought I was helping you." Her hand reached into her coat, pulling out a pistol. I froze. I didn't understand. She aimed it at me. The night pressed in, and I could hear my own ragged breath. The sound of the shot was deafening. The bullet tore through the air, grazing my shoulder. I staggered back, my legs failing beneath me. Pain exploded in my chest. I hit the ground, blood spilling from the wound. I felt like I was suffocating, the cold earth beneath me pressing into my back. Julia moved forward, standing over me. She didn't speak. I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. The pistol lowered. I knew I was going to die here. But then the crack of a branch split the air. A figure emerged from the darkness. The man in the mask. I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was hallucinating. He stepped forward, pulling something from his coat. A knife, long and sharp, gleaming in the moonlight. Julia turned, but before she could react, the knife was already embedded in her side. She gasped, stumbling back. Her pistol fell to the ground. The man in the mask didn't hesitate. He stepped forward again, pulling the blade free with a sickening sound. Julia dropped to the ground, clutching at her wound. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The pain in my shoulder was unbearable. I felt myself slipping away. The man knelt beside Julia, his hand grabbing her hair, yanking her head back. She groaned, but there was no fight left in her. He looked at me, his eyes cold. He knew I was done for. He knew she was too. He didn't kill her immediately. He just stood there, watching her bleed. I could barely stay conscious. The edges of my vision blurred. But before everything went black, I heard her whisper one last thing. I was never meant to save you. I woke up. The pain in my shoulder was gone, replaced by an overwhelming ache in my head. I tried to move, but my hands were bound. I was tied to a chair, my arms bound tightly behind me. My surroundings were dark. The only light came from a small, flickering candle. I wasn't alone. The man in the mask stood across from me, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't move, just watched me. "You're not dead," he said, his voice low, guttural. "Not yet. You've been running from me this whole time," he said, "but you don't know what's really going on. You're nothing more than bait." His words hit me like a punch. I didn't understand. Bait for who? I managed to rasp, but he didn't answer. Instead, he walked to a table beside me. There was a map spread out in front of him, covered in red marks, locations circled with precise accuracy. I didn't recognize any of the names, but I saw one familiar word. Tampa, my home. The man in the mask unfolded a document and placed it on the table. It was a list of names, dozens of them. I saw my name near the top, and below it a date. The words "final phase" were scrawled across the top. The man turned to face me. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than anything you could have imagined." I tried to speak, but he cut me off. "You were supposed to lead them to me," he said. "Now you're the one they'll come for." The pieces started to fall into place. I wasn't just running from him. I was part of something horrible. The man in the mask stepped forward, pulling a long, thin needle from his coat. He didn't speak, just jabbed it into my neck. The pain shot through me like electricity. My vision blurred. I could feel the darkness creeping in, taking hold. I tried to fight it, but it was too much. My head dropped forward, and I lost consciousness again. When I woke again, I was no longer tied to the chair. I was on the ground, my hands free, but I was disoriented. The man was gone. The candle had burned out. It was silent. I pushed myself up, the room spinning. I didn't know how long I'd been unconscious, but I knew I wasn't safe. I staggered toward the door, every step a struggle. My head felt heavy. I was dizzy. The world was spinning, but I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out. I opened the door to find a long hallway stretching out before me. It was dark, but I could see enough to know I wasn't alone. The air was cold, damp. The floor creaked beneath me as I moved down the corridor. I could hear footsteps, soft at first, then louder. Closer. I wasn't sure if it was the man in the mask or someone else, but I couldn't wait to find out. I ran. The footsteps grew louder, the shadows stretching longer. There was nowhere to hide. They were closing in again. I didn't hear them at first, the footsteps, but I felt them. The air in the hallway shifted, the temperature dropping. I turned, my eyes darting to the darkness behind me. There were no shadows, but I knew someone was there. The mask, the man in the mask. I gritted my teeth, pulling myself forward, my legs trembling beneath me. I couldn't stop. Not now. I had to move faster, push harder. My chest heaved. The walls around me seemed to close in. A low laugh echoed from behind me. The man was getting closer. I reached the end of the hall, a door to my right. My hand fumbled for the handle. It was locked. The sound of his footsteps grew louder. I backed away, looking around for an escape. There was none, only the hallway, stretching endlessly in front of me. I turned back toward the door, slamming my shoulder into it, but it wouldn't budge. A heavy thud echoed through the corridor, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure in the shadows. I wasn't alone anymore. The man in the mask had brought company. The figure stepped into the dim light. It was another man, just as tall, just as terrifying. No mask this time, but the cold eyes were unmistakable. His smile was thin, cruel. He didn't speak, but I knew what was happening. The man in the mask had brought back up. They were going to finish this, together. You think you can escape? The man without the mask finally spoke, his voice low, harsh. He took a step toward me. My hand went to my side, where the gun had been, but it was gone. I was unarmed, and there were two of them. I backed up, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. The two men moved in. The one without the mask lunged first, grabbing me by the throat. His grip was like iron. My hands shot up, trying to pry his fingers away. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I kicked out, landing a blow to his knee, but it barely fazed him. He tightened his grip. I felt my vision narrowing. The world was spinning. Then I heard a gunshot. The masked man took the shot. It wasn't aimed at me. The bullet struck the man holding me by the throat, his body jerking back. He let go of me, collapsing to the ground. Blood pooled beneath him. I hit the floor, gasping for air. I didn't know if he was dead. I didn't care. I pushed myself to my feet, my hands shaking. I had to get out. The man in the mask moved forward, his gun aimed directly at me. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I darted down the hallway, desperate. My mind raced. There had to be another way out. The walls around me seemed to close in, but then I saw it, a door. Half hidden by shadows, a narrow, barely noticeable crack in the wall. I didn't question it. I rushed toward it, pushing the door open with everything I had. It led into a narrow tunnel, cold and damp. I slipped inside, barely hearing the sound of footsteps behind me. I ran deeper, the walls of the tunnel closing in around me. I was trapped again. The sound of footsteps grew louder. They were coming after me. The man in the mask didn't hesitate. I could hear his breath now, slow, deliberate, as he closed in on me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't let him catch me. I pushed forward, my chest burning, my legs aching. The tunnel seemed endless. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, suffocating me. And then, just ahead, I saw a faint light. The tunnel opened into a large room, its walls lined with shelves, boxes stacked high, and dust everywhere. I didn't know where I was, but I didn't care. There was nowhere else to go. I turned, facing the darkness behind me. I didn't have a weapon, but I had something else. Desperation. The man in the mask stepped into the room, his silhouette casting a long shadow. "You can't keep running," he said, his voice a low growl. "There's nowhere left to hide." I backed into the corner, searching the room for anything I could use. I found it, a rusted crowbar. It was heavy in my hand, but it was better than nothing. I gripped it tight, holding it in front of me like a shield. The man in the mask didn't flinch. He took a step forward. "You really think you can stop me?" he asked. I didn't answer. I swung the crowbar at him, aiming for his head, but he was faster. He dodged, and I stumbled. He lunged at me, knocking the crowbar from my hand. It clattered across the floor, out of reach. He was on me then. His hands were around my throat again, tightening, cutting off my air. I kicked out, landing a blow to his stomach. He grunted, but didn't let go. I clawed at his hands, my nails digging into his skin, but it was useless. My vision blurred. My world was spinning again. I wasn't going to make it. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, out of nowhere, the sound of glass shattering filled the room. The man in the mask's grip loosened. I opened my eyes to see another figure standing in the doorway. It was Julia. She was standing there, holding a broken bottle in her hand. Blood dripped from the shards, and she didn't look like the same person I had known. Her face was cold, empty. "You thought I was gone," she said, her voice flat. "But I was never going to let you leave." The man in the mask staggered back, his eyes widening in shock. Julia moved forward, her hand still gripping the broken bottle. Without a word, she drove it into his side. He screamed, stumbling back, clutching at the wound. She didn't stop. She pressed harder, twisting the bottle deeper. The man in the mask collapsed. Julia didn't look at me as she walked past, her face unreadable. She knelt beside the man, her hands moving over his body. "You should have known," she said, almost to herself. I could barely hear her over the ringing in my ears. I didn't understand. "Why?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She looked at me finally, and the smile that spread across her lips was cold, empty. "Because I knew you'd come back for me." Then, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving me with the dead man and the overwhelming silence. The silence hung in the room like a thick fog, oppressive and stifling. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My mind, already reeling from the horror of the chase, was now grappling with Julia's betrayal. She had been the last person I expected to turn on me, but there she was, standing over the man in the mask, a cold smile playing on her lips. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She had been playing me all along. I stood there, unable to take my eyes off the man. His lifeless body sprawled on the cold floor. Blood pooled beneath him, mixing with the dust and grime of the room. The sharp scent of iron hung in the air, mingling with the distant smell of decay. Julia's words echoed in my mind. "Because I knew you'd come back for me." I could hardly comprehend it. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place now, but it didn't make sense. How had I missed it? The signs had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. I had been too focused on survival, too consumed with escaping to see the truth. Julia had never been the innocent victim. She was part of this twisted game all along. I moved slowly, my legs heavy as I stepped toward the body of the man in the mask. His eyes were still open, frozen in shock, and I felt nothing. No pity, no fear, just an overwhelming numbness. There was no justice in this. There was no redemption. Only the stark reality of betrayal, of manipulation, of being nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. My thoughts shifted to Julia. Where had she gone? What was she planning? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done. She had played her part, and now I was just a loose end to be tied up. I could feel it deep in my bones. I wasn't safe. Not anymore. Not as long as she was still out there. I stumbled toward the exit, my body moving on instinct. The hallway stretched before me, long and dark, but it didn't matter. I had survived so far, and maybe, just maybe, I could survive whatever came next. But as I reached the door and stepped into the night, I realized that some stories don't end with an escape. Some stories follow you, chasing you until the very end. The world outside was quiet, still, but the shadows felt closer now. There was no relief, no safety, just the weight of what had happened, of what had been lost, and the haunting thought that I was never truly free. I walked into the night, unsure of what the future held, but knowing that I would never be the same. The game wasn't over. not by a long shot. And as I disappeared into the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder who would be the next to play it. I was running out of time. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped into the stark, cold light of the newsroom. It smelled of stale coffee and printer ink. Faces blurred behind desks, some lost in their screens, others whispering over papers. I barely noticed them as I made my way to the editor's office. No one spoke to me. I wasn't sure why, but the air was thick with something. Maybe it was the feeling that things were coming to a head. I had been investigating the disappearance of Alex King for 2 months. It had started as a quiet assignment. Find out what happened to a journalist who'd gone missing while investigating corporate fraud. Simple, almost boring. But nothing was simple after I found the trail. The more I uncovered, the less I liked what I saw. I had seen things I shouldn't have. Files went missing. Sources were killed or intimidated into silence. The deeper I went, the more it felt like someone was watching me. The editor, Frank, was a blunt man, the kind who never sugarcoated anything. He didn't say hello when I walked into his office, just nodded at the chair across from his desk. He had the look of someone who'd seen it all, and most of it wasn't good. I sat. Found something? Frank asked, his voice low. I didn't know how to answer. I had found plenty, but none of it made sense. It felt like I was chasing a shadow. It had started with Alex. He had been digging into something big. That much I knew, but I hadn't found the end of the thread. What I had found was worse than I expected, and now it was closing in on me. I've got pieces, I said, leaning forward, but it's bigger than I thought. You've been saying that for weeks. I stood up. Frank was good, but he didn't get it. Nobody did. People are disappearing, Frank, I said. Alex wasn't the first. This goes all the way to the top. I'm telling you. He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded. We both know the rules here. If you want to keep your job, you keep your mouth shut. These people don't play nice. They'll kill you and everyone you know, and no one will care. The words didn't scare me. I've been doing this long enough to know what people were capable of, but this was different. I could feel the weight of the room pressing on me, a sense of urgency. Frank's warning echoed in my mind, but I didn't care. I had to know what happened to Alex. I left Frank's office in a daze, the tension building in the back of my skull. The sun was already setting outside, casting long shadows across the city streets. I needed to keep moving. There were more calls to make, more places to go, and fewer people to trust. Rachel had been helping me. She was still working for the network, still playing their game. She was smarter than me. She had learned to navigate the system, make the deals, keep quiet. But I knew Rachel. She was my friend. I trusted her. I dialed her number, waiting for her voice. She picked up after the third ring. Rachel, it's Emma. Yeah. Her voice was sharp, distant. I could tell she was busy. I'm getting close. The files, they were erased from the server. But I found a backup. It's connected to... Emma, stop. You're digging too deep. I've told you this before. I ignored her warning. Rachel always thought I was rushing into things, but she didn't understand the pull of the truth. Alex was onto something big. I need to know what it was. We need to push harder. She sighed. If you want to get yourself killed, that's your problem. But I'm not sticking around for the fallout. Get out while you still can, Emma. You're playing with fire. I ended the call before she could say anything else. She didn't get it. Rachel never had. It wasn't until I got to my apartment that I realized something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar. My heart didn't race. I didn't even flinch. This was normal. It had been happening for weeks now, small signs that someone was following me. I'd come home to find my things moved, files gone, a flicker of someone's shadow in the corner of my eye. I reached for the gun I kept in my desk drawer and checked it, a cold rush of adrenaline sparking in my veins. The silence in the apartment was deafening. I stepped inside cautiously, my ears straining for the faintest sound. The place was untouched, but I could tell someone had been here. I didn't know if it was the conspiracy or someone from the network, but it didn't matter. I was done waiting. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Rachel. Don't go digging any deeper. She had no idea. She didn't understand that digging deeper was the only thing keeping me alive. She had already made her choice. I grabbed my coat and moved out the door. I had no time to waste. Tonight, I would meet with the last person who could give me answers. I couldn't afford to wait anymore. I arrived at the alley where I was supposed to meet the source. Someone who claimed to know what happened to Alex. His name was James, and he was the only person left who had spoken to Alex before he disappeared. I had been waiting for weeks to track him down. The air was cold, thick with fog. I didn't see him at first. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. He was tall, built like a bouncer. His face was hard, unshaven, his eyes dark and wary. "You're Emma Parker?" he asked, his voice gruff. I nodded. "I've got information, but you're not going to like it," he said. I tensed, prepared for whatever he was going to say. He handed me a thick envelope. Inside were photos, documents, and a flash drive. "You've been asking about Alex," James continued. "You want to know what happened? Look at this." I glanced down at the first photo. Alex, standing outside a building I didn't recognize. And there, just behind him, a shadowy figure. I recognized him instantly. It was Frank. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Frank had been involved. The editor who had warned me off. The same man who had kept me in the dark. I looked up at James, my voice steady. "What is this?" Alex was onto something big. He started digging into the wrong people, and when he got too close, they did what they do best. He's dead, Emma, and it's not just him. There's a lot more where that came from. I gripped the envelope tightly, my pulse quickening, a cold knot settling in my stomach. The door slammed open, and I didn't have time to react. A sharp pain exploded in my side. My vision blurred as I collapsed to the ground. The last thing I saw before everything went black was James, standing over me. But his face had changed. His eyes weren't dark anymore. They were cold. He wasn't a friend. He was part of it all. I woke up in a dimly lit room, my hands bound to a chair. Blood trickled down my face, and I could taste it in my mouth. Frank's voice echoed in the silence. "Did you really think you could dig into this and walk away, Emma?" I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight. I didn't want to beg. I wasn't going to. But this was bad. Worse than I could have imagined. "You were always too clever for your own good," Frank said, his footsteps approaching. "You thought you were uncovering the truth. But now, you've dug too deep, and there's no going back. The truth? It was already gone. Whatever Alex had found, whatever this conspiracy was, there was no escape from it now. I was in it, whether I liked it or not." The silence stretched on. I tried to breathe through the pain. "I'm not done," I whispered. Frank's laugh was low and chilling. "You will be, Emma. Soon enough." The pain in my side was relentless. The blood had dried against my skin. My arms were sore from the ropes that cut into my wrists. The room was cold, but the sweat on my skin fell hotter with every passing minute. Frank wasn't lying when he said there was no way out. I had thought for a brief moment that I could somehow talk my way out of this, that I could reason with them, but I knew now there was no reasoning with them. I was a pawn, and pawns didn't survive. I sat still. It was pointless to struggle. The more I moved, the more the pain from my side surged. The world around me was a blur. Dark walls, flickering lights, the hum of a fan in the corner. But there was something else, a presence. I had been alone, but now it felt as though I wasn't. Someone was watching me. I strained my ears, but there were no footsteps, no voices. Only the silence. It was louder than any sound. Then I heard it. A door creaked. Footsteps. Closer. I sat back in the chair, trying to breathe, trying to hide the fear rising in my chest. The door opened and Frank stepped in. He was alone. "You're awake," he said, his voice like gravel. He didn't seem surprised. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He circled around me slowly, like a predator inspecting its prey. I could feel the weight of his stare, even though I didn't look at him. Nothing to say? He asked, as if he was disappointed. You know, I thought you'd be smarter than this, Emma. I thought you'd back off, but now it's too late. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He was right. It was too late. The moment I'd picked up that damn flash drive, it had been over. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. You've been poking around in places you shouldn't, and now you're going to pay for it. I had heard those words before, and they still didn't scare me. I had to keep my focus. I couldn't let him know how much he rattled me. I forced my breathing to slow, my eyes narrowing as I looked past him to the door, searching for any escape. None came. Frank's presence was suffocating. He circled me, and I fought to keep my composure. I wasn't scared. I wasn't. But my body felt weak. I wasn't used to this. I wasn't used to being trapped. He grabbed my chin, lifting my face to meet his. The grip was iron, painful. My eyes burned. My mouth was dry. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I last ate or drank. It felt like days. Maybe it had been. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He had already won. He released his grip on my chin and stepped back, giving me space to breathe. But the silence that followed was worse than the pain. It was the kind of silence that felt like a countdown, like a clock ticking down to the end of everything. I clenched my fists, the ropes biting into my skin. It didn't matter. I wasn't leaving until I had answers. What do you want from me? I managed to rasp. Frank smiled. It was cold. I want you to understand. I want you to know that there's no escape. There's no one who can help you. Not even your precious editor, Frank. He's in on this too, Emma. We all are. I felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath me. I couldn't speak. The room was spinning. Frank was one of them. He had been all along. You'll never get out of this alive, Frank said, his voice smooth, like he was enjoying my suffering. They'll make sure of that. The sound of a door opening again made me snap to attention. It was different this time, quieter, softer. Someone else was here. I couldn't turn my head, but I could feel their presence in the room. Frank's eyes narrowed as he glanced over his shoulder. Who was that? I asked, my voice trembling, but I hated myself for it. Someone you'll be seeing a lot of soon, Frank replied, a cold glint in his eyes. We all have a part to play. Some of us are just better at it than others. The figure stepped closer, and I realized with a sickening twist in my gut that it was another man. His face was familiar, but I couldn't place it. He wore a dark suit, sharp and immaculate. His hands were steepled in front of him as he watched me with cold, calculating eyes. Frank didn't seem to care about the new arrival. His attention was on me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Something had changed. I didn't know what, but I knew it wasn't good. Emma Parker, the man said, his voice low and deliberate. I've heard a lot about you. I didn't respond. What was the point? Whatever game they were playing, I wasn't interested. I had one goal now, survival. And whatever it took to get the truth, I would take it. The silence stretched on, unbearable. I couldn't stay still anymore. The ropes were cutting into my skin. My hands were numb. I had to do something. Frank had stepped back, but the other man hadn't moved. They both stood there, watching me. The quiet was unbearable. The other man's eyes never left me. They were cold, calculating. I could feel his eyes on my every move. I took a deep breath, then lunged forward, using the last of my strength. I didn't care about the pain. I didn't care about anything anymore. I just wanted out. The rope strained against my movements. I twisted, pushing my shoulders forward, my hands slipping, but they didn't budge. The man stepped forward, grabbing my arm and yanking me back into the chair. You don't get to make the rules, Emma, he said, his voice low and threatening. You'll do what we say, or there will be consequences. I hissed, trying to twist free, but it was no use. My body was too weak, my strength too drained. Stop, Frank's voice came from behind me, calm and cold. She'll never learn. Let her go, came a voice from the door. I didn't believe what I was hearing. It couldn't be. Rachel stepped into the room, her face calm, but her eyes were wide with something I couldn't place. What the hell are you doing here? I managed to rasp. She glanced at Frank and the man in the suit before turning back to me. I'm saving your life, Emma. But I didn't understand. Rachel had been part of the system. She had been working with them. Why was she here now? I couldn't move. Not because of the ropes, those I had grown used to. Not because of the blood that clung to my skin, though it stung when I shifted. It was Rachel. She was here, and she was with them. The last person I ever thought would betray me had just walked through the door. And now, there was no way out. The man in the suit, the one I still couldn't name, turned his eyes on Rachel. They were cold, calculating. You're wasting our time. Rachel didn't flinch. Her face was unreadable, but there was a hint of tension in her shoulders, like she knew something was coming that neither of us could stop. I wanted to scream at her, demand to know why, how long she'd been playing me, how long she'd known this was where I'd end up. But the words wouldn't come. I just sat there, struggling to breathe through the knot in my chest, trying to hold it together for just a little longer. I couldn't lose control. Not yet. Not now. Rachel's eyes flicked to me, and for the briefest moment, I saw something in them. A flicker of regret? Of fear? It was gone before I could be sure. You're not supposed to be here, Emma, she said, her voice calm but shaking. None of this was supposed to happen. Her words were a puzzle piece I didn't want to solve. What the hell did she mean by that? I was here because I dug too deep, because I wanted the truth. But now that I was staring it in the face, I realized how deep I had gone. There was no escape. You should have listened, Rachel continued, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. But you had to dig. You had to push. Now look where we are. I wanted to shout at her, ask her why she was still talking when I was stuck here, but all I could do was sit there. The man in the suit stepped forward. The thing is, Rachel, he said, his voice cold, you've been working for us, but you've gone soft. You've been protecting her. Now that's a problem. He said the words slowly, methodically, like he was savoring them. The implication was there. Rachel had crossed a line. I saw it in her face before she even reacted. There was no turning back now. I wasn't the only one in danger anymore. And I was sick to my stomach knowing that Rachel was going to be dragged into this mess with me. Rachel stepped back, her hands trembling. I'm sorry, Emma, she whispered, but there's nothing more I can do. The walls felt like they were closing in. I had no answers. I was trapped in a game I didn't understand, surrounded by people who wanted nothing more than to crush me under their weight. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I didn't know what it was, but there was something in Rachel's face when she spoke to me. It wasn't just regret. It was a warning. Maybe she had made her choice, but maybe, just maybe, she could still help me. I couldn't let that hope go. Not yet. The man in the suit stepped forward again. Enough with the pleasantries, he snapped. I've had enough of this. His voice carried a finality that made me want to shrink back, but I stayed still. I had to stay still. I had to wait for something. Anything. Rachel didn't seem to notice the man's impatience. Her eyes were on me, and for the first time since I had been taken, I saw something other than coldness. Fear. Fear, not for herself, but for me. She didn't say anything at first, but I saw it in the way she held herself. She was afraid I was going to do something stupid, something that would get us both killed. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to focus on her. There has to be a way out, I said, my voice cracking slightly. Rachel's lips parted, as if she was going to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she gave a quick shake of her head. You don't understand, Emma, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There's no escape. It's not just us anymore. Her words hung in the air like smoke. What do you mean? I asked, too quickly, my voice rising. I'm not working for you anymore. Rachel said, her voice steady now. I'm working for them. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't process it. She wasn't working for me. She wasn't trying to save me. It had all been for nothing. Before I could respond, the man in the suit snapped his fingers. Enough with the sentimental bullshit, he said. You've dug your grave, Emma. It's time to lie in it. Rachel flinched, her eyes darting to the door. The tension in the room was palpable. I could feel it pressing on my chest. The air was thick with it, suffocating. I was about to break, but something was changing. The man in the suit walked toward me. He was calm, calculated. He had all the time in the world. And then it happened. Something I didn't expect. Rachel moved. I don't know what came over her. Maybe she saw the look in my eyes. Maybe she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. But in that moment, she lunged. It wasn't graceful or planned. It was instinctive. She threw herself toward the man, grabbing his wrist, trying to pull his gun from his holster. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand it. Rachel, the one who had sold me out, was now fighting for my life. But her desperation only made things worse. The man was faster. He twisted, using her momentum against her. In a split second, he had her by the throat, slamming her against the wall. Stupid bitch, he spat, his grip tightening. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My movements stiff and stoic from fright. I watched Rachel struggle for air, her eyes wide with terror. But there was nothing I could do. Nothing. The man let her drop to the ground. She gasped for air, her face pale, her body trembling. You should have stayed out of this, the man said, his voice low, almost regretful. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, just when I thought Rachel had betrayed me for the last time, I saw something. Rachel wasn't gasping for air. She was holding something. Her hand was clenched tightly around a small object. Something hard, something cold. She twisted her body, her arm jerking up, and then I saw it. The flash of silver, the glint of a knife. Before the man could react, Rachel plunged the knife into his side. It was quick, brutal. He didn't have time to scream. I didn't know what to feel. I didn't know if I should be relieved, horrified, or grateful. He staggered back, clutching his side, his face contorted in pain and rage. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I just moved. Rachel had made her choice. She had crossed the line, and she would never be the same. I watched as she struggled to stand. The man in the suit was still alive but badly wounded. He bled, but there was something more dangerous than blood in his eyes. He wasn't just going to kill us now. No, he was going to make us pay for this. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what to do. But I couldn't wait for Rachel to fix this. She couldn't save us now. I had to take the reins. It was my turn to fight. The man gritted his teeth, his face twisting in pain. But he wasn't going down that easily. He reached for his gun, his eyes never leaving us. I didn't think. I just acted. I threw myself at him, using the last of my strength, trying to disarm him, to stop him before it was too late. The gun was heavy in my hands, but my fingers locked around it, pushing it away from me. The man growled, the fury in his eyes evident as he fought back. I could feel the sweat on my face, the terror clawing at my chest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let him win. I kicked at his knees, hoping for leverage, trying to get his gun out of my grasp. But he was stronger. He was trained. His fist connected with my jaw, and the pain exploded in my face, blurring my vision for a moment. The world spun. Rachel's voice broke through the haze. Get up. You have to finish it. Her words weren't comforting. They were a command, and I knew I had no choice but to obey. I pulled myself together, focusing on his movements. He was weakening, but he was still dangerous. His face was pale, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Blood was dripping from his side, staining the floor beneath us. The man's grip on the gun slipped. He wasn't going to be able to hold on much longer. I lunged. This time, I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I was thinking only of survival. My hands found the gun again, and I shoved it toward his chest. The cold metal pressed against his skin, and then I squeezed the trigger. The sound was deafening. He jerked back, his eyes wide with shock, but there was nothing more he could do. He collapsed on the floor in a heap, lifeless. I stood there for a moment, my breath coming in harsh gasps, the weight of what I had just done settling into my bones. I had killed him. Rachel didn't say anything at first. She didn't move either. She just stood there, staring at the body, as if she couldn't believe it had happened. I couldn't blame her. I didn't know if I believed it either. But there was no time for that now. I grabbed Rachel by the arm, pulling her toward the door. The hallway outside was dimly lit, and there was no sound. No footsteps. No voices. It was as if the world had gone silent. We ran. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I could feel the eyes on me, the fear gnawing at my insides, but I kept running. I had no idea where we were going, no idea how to get out, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to stop. Rachel stumbled next to me, her breath ragged. She was still shaky, still trying to process what had just happened. But I didn't have the luxury of slowing down. I had to get us out. We reached a door at the end of the hallway. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed the handle, pushing it open. The air outside hit me like a slap in the face. It was cold, fresh. I hadn't realized how long I'd been inside, how long I'd been trapped in that room with him. The world outside felt different now. It wasn't the same. We weren't the same. I looked at Rachel. She didn't meet my gaze. She was still processing everything, her mind trying to make sense of the chaos. But I couldn't wait for her to figure it out. I pulled her with me as we sprinted toward the car parked across the lot. I didn't even know who had left it there, but I didn't care. I didn't care about anything anymore except getting away. We reached the car, and I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing. I couldn't focus. I couldn't breathe. The world was spinning, but we had to get out of here. I finally found the keys, and I shoved them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into gear, speeding out of the parking lot. Rachel didn't say anything. She didn't look at me. She just stared out the window, her face pale, her expression unreadable. I didn't blame her. I wasn't sure what I felt either. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. It felt like the world was still suffocating me, but at least we were free. At least we had made it out. But even as the miles passed, the weight of everything that had happened didn't go away. The faces of the men, the body on the floor, the blood, none of it left my mind. I couldn't shake it. I glanced at Rachel. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. "You okay?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't look at me. She didn't even acknowledge the question. She just stared straight ahead. I knew she wasn't okay. She would never be okay again. But neither would I. We drove in silence for hours, crossing state lines, heading towards some place that was as far away from that hell as we could get. But no matter how far we went, no matter how much distance we put between ourselves and the men who wanted us dead, we both knew the truth. This wasn't over. It would never be over. The next morning, I woke up in a motel room, the sheets tangled around my legs. Rachel was gone. I didn't even need to check the door. I knew. I had seen the look in her eyes the night before. She was gone, and she had left without a word. I didn't know what to feel. I didn't know if I should be relieved or angry. She had betrayed me. She had helped them. And yet, in the end, she had fought for me. She had tried to save me, even if it was too late. But she had made her choice, and I had made mine. There was no going back. I got up, grabbed my things, and walked out of the room. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew one thing. I wasn't running anymore. I was going to face this. I was going to find the answers, no matter what it cost. And maybe, just maybe, I would find Rachel again. The door to the motel slammed shut behind me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was free,